episode 85 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 14th year, I found myself asking the question, where is the podcast that will help me do my job? I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. I'd like to extend a very special welcome this week to listeners Karen in Connecticut, Stacy in Maryland, Catherine and Anna in Texas, and Laura in Washington State. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and questions and episode suggestions either on Facebook, Twitter, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I will be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now, for today's episode, Library of Congress, Resources for All, and my interview with Tom Bober. Friends, I'm so excited to be sharing this conversation with you today. Tom Bober, welcome to the podcast. I asked you to join this conversation because I can't think of a school librarian with more firsthand knowledge of the Library of Congress than you.
Amy, I am so excited to be here with you today. Thank you for having me.
Oh, well, I'll tell you what, the timing is perfect because the other reason why I wanted to interview you especially is because I know teachers and school librarians are either in the first days of their school or they're starting, and it's unlike anything we've ever experienced. And regardless whether we are starting in person or virtually, the Library of Congress is, if I'm not mistaken, the world's biggest OER. And these resources are free and accessible to everyone.
Yeah, there are millions upon millions of digitized resources available through the Library of Congress. And when I'm looking for primary sources for whatever the topic may be of study, whether it's something with my elementary teachers and students, or whether I'm helping out middle school teachers, high school teachers, Library of Congress is typically the first place I go and visit because of the sheer amount of material that they have available on their website. And the amazing thing is that that's just a fraction of what they actually hold. So there are millions and millions of more materials if you are lucky enough when we are all able to leave again freely and travel to DC and go into the building. The materials there are amazing as well, but they are adding more digitized items all of the time.
Well, and I'm really glad, and I think I appreciate that it is a great resource for you, and I'm going to be the first one to admit that in my 14 years of being a school librarian, and let's reach back even further because I was a high school teacher for 10 years before that, I can honestly say the Library of Congress, and I'm embarrassed to say this, was not tops of my list to check. And this is even worse. I was a history major. I taught social studies. Do you know what an amazing teacher I would have been if I had had this conversation with you at the beginning of my career?
Let's have a kindred story right here. So let me tell you my kind of origin story, I guess, with the Library of Congress. It goes all the way back to right around the year, it was 99 or 2000. I don't remember exactly. And I was teaching at the time and in a classroom and was going to a local technology conference. And there in the exhibit hall was a little booth set up with the Library of Congress. And I saw all these amazing materials. I remember the person I spoke to, her name was Gail Petrie, and she shared all of these amazing materials. I got so excited. I ran with them back to my classroom. And I remember that next week using them with my students and the whole process falling completely flat because I had no idea what to do with them. Like I thought that my excitement around these documents and these images would just by osmosis translate over to my students. And it just didn't happen. And I got so discouraged and that I tried it one or two more times, and then it just kind of got put onto the shelf. And I just became kind of a fan of the resources with no idea of how to actually bring them into my classroom. So it wasn't until 15 years later that I get this email from the Library of Congress telling me about a summer teacher institute that I could apply for. And immediately I flashed back to that miserable day with my students where I just completely failed them. And I thought, I want to do this. I was in the library in my school library at the time as a librarian. I thought, I want to do this. I want to figure this out. And that summer teacher institute in the summer of, actually, it wasn't 15, it was 2013. In the summer of 2013 was my kind of first steps into really bringing these materials into my students' learning.
Well, and I'm glad that I want to get this out early in our conversation, because I know there's some listeners who they'll listen to this podcast, but their initial concern is that the Library of Congress is way over the heads of their littles, of their elementary students. And, it seems to me like you said, you bring these materials, and as somebody who feels passionately about the history, is because as adults, we've probably taken enough history classes to appreciate the context. What we fail to recognize is our students, regardless of their age, do not have the context of what we are showing them and the appreciation of how awesome it is, because they haven't had the experiences that adults have going through a high school program and a collegiate program. So I want to make sure that we emphasize that the Library of Congress is a resource that is as applicable to our younger students as it is to our older students, if that's okay.
There are, first of all, there is a team at the Library of Congress that is tasked with reaching out to educators. I want to put that out there. So there's literally a group of people that I could point to and name to you that is what they do. And they are as interested in reaching out to those elementary teachers that teach students of all ages, in addition to the middle school, the high school teachers. They do get more middle school and high school teachers, without a doubt, that reach out to them. But they are interested across the board. Amy, I've had regularly my kindergarten students working with historical documents. It's a totally regular thing in my library. It's often imagery, right? Because most of them are pre-readers or emerging readers, but they take that imagery and they dive deeply into it. And the piece that I try to bring to the table when I'm selecting a primary source for these students, really any students, is I want to give them something that has a little bit of mystery to it, so that it's engaging, so that I want to ask questions, so I want to look closer at it and learn from it. But it's not like the textbook or the 32-page kind of traditional nonfiction book that just has this kind of neat and tidy beginning, middle, and end. I want it to drive students to want to go look at something else or watch something else or read something else. And I think that's kind of the magic behind a really well-selected primary source. And it is as effective at with 5-year-olds as it is with a 15-year-old. Well,
and friends, I want to, I think you are hoping, and this is the case. Tom has produced an incredible resource for us in the show notes. And so I want to thank my guests when they do that, because, friends, what usually happens in an interview is I come up with some questions that I want to make sure to ask, and I send those to our guests who are going to be on the podcast. But I don't have any sort of resources. And all of a sudden I open up this document, and Tom has generously embedded our show notes with some phenomenal resources. And friends, this is important because so many of us are, looking at teaching virtually, using a lot of digital sources. And the Library of Congress has, by and large, its collection is entirely digital because of how much it is shared around the world. And so, friends, this is an OER. This is going to be a resource which we don't have to wait and see if they're going to open it up or give it to us for free, like World Book or Britannica or Capstone. We don't have to hope that they're going to open up these databases, because these databases have been open up the whole time. And I will say, I didn't realize, and I should have, that they have audio recordings, which are in the database. Library of Congress, you want to invite your inquiring minds, your students, you want to capture their interest. A lot of these are recordings, and you can play these things for the kids, and they are, it's not like presenting a piece of digitized print and saying, okay, let's read this next passage. Obviously, you started off in the classroom and you became a school librarian, and you started to mention that you were actually in the Summer Institute. Could we start off and talk a little bit about the Summer Institute? Because I know a little bit about the Summer Institute just because I didn't get in, but I'm not bitter. But I do want you to tell our listeners just how much fun you had, because I'm not done applying, and I'll be honest, I didn't know about it until I think just a year ago or 2 years. So friends, this Summer Teacher Institute that Tom is going to tell us a little bit about takes applicants. And I obviously, with the pandemic, I don't know what this next summer is like. But Tom, could you tell us a little bit about the Summer Institute that you attended?
Absolutely. So the Summer Institute is a week-long professional development session that happens at the Library of Congress. There's actually 3 buildings. The Library of Congress is made up of 3 buildings. So at one of the buildings of the Library of Congress, and you have access to all of the materials in the Library of Congress. You also have access to their archivists, their historians, as well as that core group of staff that I mentioned earlier that are tasked with kind of bridging that gap between all of these materials and educators. And a big focus is, how do students interact with these materials in really effective ways? And you walk out of that week exhausted, number one. You walk out of that week having seen some things that you can't believe have been put in front of you, some documents or artifacts. And you walk away, in my experience, and I've heard from many others who have done this, having experienced some of the best professional development that maybe you ever have or ever will. And so I did that in 13. And they actually have 5 one-week sessions. So you apply to, as you know, Amy, if you've applied, you apply to one of these weeks. And they have about 20 or 25 spots for each week that they're working to fill in those. And then what they started to do in 2014 is they also started to specialize some of those weeks. So, for example, they started out doing a science week that focuses in on science instruction. They started doing a civil rights week that's focused in on all their civil rights artifacts that they hold at the Library of Congress. And they continue to adapt that. When when ALA was just in DC, this couple summer, was it last summer? Mm-hmm. They had a special, I think it was a 2 or a 2.5 day just for school librarians. And so they continue to kind of adapt and adjust this experience, but at the core, it's exactly what I described, and it is quite incredible. I snuck in 2014 when they said that they were switching it up and adding the science element in. I sent an email to one of their people there and pleaded my case about why I should be able to attend this second one, and I was the only one to be able to come in for a second week, and it was just as incredible. But that was when, I hope I'm not jumping the gun here, but that's when I started to think that maybe I wanted to even be more involved with the Library of Congress, and that got me thinking about another program that they do
which is their teacher in residence program. Well, and I wanted to ask you about that because, I think one of the reasons why I wanted to go to this program is because as a school librarian, I expected that most of their applicants were teachers and not necessarily school librarians. And I thought, now I've got an edge. I've got like this edge that's going to get me into this program. And I will say, friends, I have included a link to this program in the show notes. And, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but I believe that this program is entirely paid for with the exception of travel and housing. So you are paying for your travel, provided obviously writing a grant is something that you might consider doing given the extraordinary nature of these circumstances. But you pay for your travel, you pay for your room and board. I'm not sure if the Airbnbs, is a really good option given where it is. And then I believe you'd be responsible for picking up your meals as well. Am I correct, Tom? They completely cover the actual institute itself. There's no cost for that. And they actually give you a kind of a cafeteria gift card, I guess you could say. And so your breakfasts and lunches are actually even covered. You're kind of just on your own for dinner. And then, like you said, the travel and the lodging, which I know for some can be a challenge. But and the other thing that they look at, Amy, I'm going to just throw a couple little tidbits in here for our school librarians that are interested in this. You talked about that application process. I went ahead and I'll talk about the teacher in residence piece in a minute, but I did get a chance to score people who were wanting to come to this institute. One thing that they are looking for is they're really looking for an enthusiasm to want to grow in your ability to use primary sources. So trying to make sure that comes across if that's something you decide to pursue. But the other thing that they're open to and they find intriguing are pairs or teams that come in. So teaming yourself with a classroom teacher or another librarian not only might make you more appealing in the application process, but also when we talk about things like lodging, I know sometimes people share hotel rooms or something like that. That could be another cost-saving measure that could make something like this more feasible. All right. Well, pro tip, friends, I do appreciate Tom sharing with us because I will not be surprised to hear if there are some listeners who turn around and apply to this program with the understanding that we have to sort of hold our breath for next summer and be hopeful. So I do want to talk about your teacher in residence program because this is amazing. The more I consider the opportunity to leave your job and move to be the teacher in residence at the Library of Congress, I think I can't wait to hear about this because as a school librarian, how you see this is going to be vastly different from, say, a classroom teacher. Yeah, I think, one of the people that puts on the Summer Teacher Institute is typically the teacher in residence. And so that was where I was first introduced to the position. And the teacher in residence at the time was a teacher out of New York. The first year I went, but then the second year I went, it was a school librarian. And Rebecca Newland, and she's out just outside of D.C. In Virginia, I believe. And she... both of them just had an awesome kind of representation of here's an educator who is doing something completely, in some ways, outside of their comfort zone, but also kind of owning the place that they have within this big organization. So it got me thinking about applying. I'm going to cut out all the application story, but basically I applied. I was lucky enough to be accepted. That year I was teacher in residence, one of two teachers in residence. Trey Smith was the other one. He's a science teacher out of Philadelphia, an incredible educator. And part of the reason that we're there is to represent what the current state of education is to the Library of Congress, in a sense, so that as they're creating materials, as they're thinking about reaching out to educators, we are a first point of contact to say, will this work? Or will this not work?
and how can we adapt it to meet the needs of more educators? Another thing that we do as teachers in residence is a lot of writing. And I did not consider myself a writer prior to taking on that position. It wasn't something that I did regularly, but we also go and dig through the archives and find materials that we think will work in different educational circumstances, different grade levels, different topics. And we might write blog posts. We might write articles for publication, all types of different writing to reach out to teachers. And then webinars, and I mentioned the Summer Teacher Institute, putting together collaboratively some of the materials on the teachers page of the Library of Congress. So it's a very different work environment than what I was used to as a classroom teacher and then a school librarian. I was working in a cubicle and had, people kind of right next to me, kind of at all hours of the day, talking and having conversations, not seeing students. That was really difficult for me, as I'm sure it is for most, if not all, the teachers in residences, but also having access to not just all of these incredible materials, but the people who are overseen with taking care of them. And that was the amazing part. And the one thing that I walked away with, I would say about myself after that year, was that even in that institution, which to me is elevated, right? The Library of Congress, I had a voice in that institution that was valued amongst its members. And it's not just me. Educators have a voice that is valued amongst those individuals. And I think that was a huge takeaway, and it just helped me embrace what they were doing and want to bring them into my school experience with my students even more.
Well, and I just respect the Library of Congress so much more now, because it would have been much easier for them to simply acknowledge that they are going to be appealing to the field of academia. They're going to appeal to collegiate and it's more of a scholarly database to be accessed by people around the world. And it would have been just so easy to sit back and say, yeah, we're the Library of Congress. But instead, they create this whole department intended on wooing or attracting these educators, and you do have to convince educators that there is material in the Library of Congress which is applicable to the grades that they teach. And so I give them a lot of credit, and I think what I love when I started looking at your body of work, because you've written so much, is that you went through this process as a school librarian, which means you have the eyes of a school librarian. And I think listeners can appreciate that when we make that transformation, most of us were classroom teachers before we became librarians, and how you look at things changes dramatically as a school librarian. So I think of you sort of as a liaison, because you were a school librarian delving into the largest collection of anything in the world.
I actually realized in November at the AASL conference that year that one thing that I needed was not just this connection with the Library of Congress, but I needed to be back in my library. I needed to be using these materials with my students, but I also wanted to take all of that experience and I wanted to share it out with librarians and other educators, because I think not just the materials are powerful, more importantly, the experiences, the learning experiences that the students have are powerful. And when you can have powerful, amazing learning experiences time after time by utilizing these resources in really imaginative and effective ways, then for me, at least, that was something I wanted to get out to as many people as possible. So when you say that I've written a lot and I've shared a lot, that is the reason why, because I just believe in these learning experiences so much, and what the use of primary sources allows, how the use of primary sources allows that to happen.
Well, and I'm really really excited because we're going to link a way that you can access the articles that Tom has written. And I want to include this just because we're talking about the Library of Congress. And I think to try and summarize it in a sentence is impossible. But I pulled this from the Library of Congress page. And they said, quote, "The Library of Congress is the largest library in the world, with millions of books, recordings, photographs, newspapers, maps, and manuscripts in its collection," end quote. And as I confessed very early in our conversation, I was absolutely daunted. I don't know where to even start when it comes to looking for resources for my students and my staff. And I'll be honest, I'm intimidated by the enormity of the collection. So, which is why the conversation we're having with you today is wonderful, because you're going to give us a way to build this into our program.
So let me give you a couple really solid entry points, because I hear a little bit of anxiety, right? There's tens of millions. Yes, I'm a librarian. I know how to search, but how do I do that effectively? And how do I find the right things? How do I find the things that my students are really going to connect with? So I want to give you a few places that you can go that will be kind of great entry points, I think. And the first one is the teachers page on the Library of Congress. It's really easy to remember. It's loc.gov/teachers. And you can go there as a great jumping off point. They've got a few things there that I think they've got lots of things there, but I want to highlight three of them. The first thing I want to highlight is they have primary source sets. So these are curated sets of primary sources, about a dozen to a dozen and a half, on a variety of different topics that are ones that they would regularly get requests for from educators. And so they've kind of done some of that legwork for you. They've pulled together these sources. It is not exhaustive. It is kind of the highlights. It is, for some of us, a great thing to just take and run with. For others of us, depending on how we like to work, it might be a great jumping off point for us to start with and then make decisions about digging deeper in one direction or another. So primary source sets are one. The second thing I want to highlight is linked off of that teachers page, and that is the Teaching with Primary Sources blog. And I mentioned earlier that I had done some writing for them with that. Other teachers and residences have done writing for them. That group that I mentioned, that educational group, does writing for the blog. And it is a treasure trove. And the reason I think it pairs so nicely with the primary source sets is that the blog, in many of the posts, gets to some of the pedagogy. How do I use these things with my students? And starts to just break down in very manageable chunks something that I could pick up and use. And so sometimes when I'm reading their blog, I find a great resource. Sometimes when I'm reading the blog, they maybe use a resource that I'm not interested in, but I love the strategy that they use for students interacting with the resource. And so I can kind of pick and choose what I want from it. And you can subscribe to that blog too, so it gets delivered to your mail and email and what have you. But you can also just go in and check and search the backlog of it as well. And then the third resource that I love off of the teachers page is listed under using primary sources, but it is the primary source analysis tool. That is my foundational way that I have students interact with primary sources. And along with that, there are teacher's guides, so that if you're using it with images or sound recordings or manuscripts or whatever different type of format, there's a different teacher's guide that will guide you through how to use that resource with students. And so we go all the way from the resources themselves to the how to use the resources, and a little bit of great real world examples in between that I think are three great tools to use off of that teacher's page.
When I was doing research for this episode, I actually found the teacher page that you're talking about, and I've now made it as a little favicon on my toolbar, because I recognize just how valuable this can be, especially when we are teaching in, so many of us are relying on digital resources because we are not teaching in person, and we are relying on these resources. And even if you are teaching in person, many of us are not circulating materials. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So friends, like I said, we've got many links in these show notes. I sometimes joke that when we talk about Pinterest, you need to set a timer, because you will find yourself spending an inordinate amount of time staring at a screen, making pins that you are not likely to very much use. But I felt that way when I looked at this teacher resource page. I was like, dude, I'm going to have to set a timer, because I'm going to find myself just getting swallowed up by all of these wonderful things, and they're very exciting. You know, these 30 blog posts in Knowledge Quest, the really exciting thing is these are about specific books that many of us have in our library. So I picked one that I found especially appealing, because I know exactly where it is in my collection, and that's David Egger's Her Right Foot. And it's the story of the construction of the Statue of Liberty. Could you walk us through how you would, because your article does this and it's fantastic, could you walk us through how you would use one of your blogs to design a lesson in both a physical space like our classroom or our library, and then how would you suggest we modify this for distance learning, and one that we would do remotely?
Absolutely. So one thing I want to start out with is I put out a monthly blog post for Knowledge Quest, and all of them have to do with pairing picture books and primary sources. And they're typically these historically based picture books that a lot of us love. But in my experience, I didn't always know how to use as effectively. And in this one example with Her Right Foot, one thing that I would see over and over again, and I would see this with middle school students all the way down to my kindergarten students, I would read one of these historically based picture books. I would start off with saying that this is a real story. And I think because of the gorgeous illustrations that are in these books today, inevitably, I would have one or more students on that last page as we would finish up, ask the question, is this real? Like, did this really happen? And it really made me think we need to pair historical documents with these, or historical items with these, so that students see that this is from a real moment in time. And that was kind of some of the inspirations. One thing I love about this particular picture book is they talk about the construction of the Statue of Liberty. And for me, it was an area that could be explored a little more deeply, and that there are amazing primary sources about. And talk about using primary sources with young students, we do some work with some of our younger students in second grade around American symbols. So this is a perfect American symbol piece to explore. And if we would then pull out some amazing visuals, one of my favorite is a photograph called Workmen Constructing the Statue of Liberty. And it is a photograph with dozens of workers, timber on the ground. They're holding hammers and vices and all types of things. And then in the background, there is this gigantic arm with holding a tablet. And the closer you look at it, you realize, oh my goodness, this is exactly what's happening. They're constructing the Statue of Liberty kind of on the spot. And so what we've done with this particular picture book is we've read up to that point where they start to talk about the construction. And then we stop the book and we start to bring out some of these visuals, and we start to explore what did that mean to construct the Statue of Liberty. So we not only have that visual, we've got another visual of it being reconstructed, being set up on Liberty Island, where you have most of the statue constructed, but the head and part of the arm is just kind of the framework. And there's little images. This is actually a drawing image, but there's little men like hanging off of the statue. They're really engaging. And you start to get a feel for what this process was. And like I mentioned before, when you interact with primary sources, it gets these students asking questions. They want to know more. And so I don't have to build in the engagement. The primary source and the interaction with the primary source builds in the engagement. And then we go from this idea to circle back to the picture book after we've had that experience and we've started to ask the how did this happen, we return to the picture book. And if you're familiar with it, they talk about the statue kind of representing freedom and walking towards America and all of these wonderful symbolic ideas. And so we finish the picture book, and then we ask the question, okay, we've explored how the Statue of Liberty was built, but let's ask the question about why it was built. And it's more than just we wanted to have a gift from France to the United States, right? I mean, it's built into the picture book. And so students, this picture book essentially becomes a secondary source to answer the question of why. And so that is one of the interactions between picture books and this particular primary source that is possible. One thing that I very intentionally do is in all of my blog posts, I incorporate a curated set of primary sources that go well beyond the blog post so that you can imagine other ways that primary sources and picture books can be paired up.
Well, and if we are doing a read aloud, we would need the book, but the resources from we would be able to post on, say, our Google Meet screen or our Zoom screen. We could share the screen with our students so that they could look up close at these pictures, even, dare I say, closer than they would if they were in your library. Because they're going to get up to the screen. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. So if we're working in a virtual environment and we're in a situation where our students have devices, you're right. We would have to provide the read aloud. And so we'd have to check with the publisher allowances for that and have it posted in a way that's secure and all those things. I'm not the expert on that, but I know there are great resources out there for doing those things. Mm-hmm. But as far as then providing the primary source, all of these are digitally available. And as you mentioned at the very beginning, they're all freely available. And so we can just provide that link out to students. And you're absolutely right with images, especially with another type of favorite resource of mine, with detailed maps. You can zoom in on these things and you wouldn't get this level of detail if you just printed it out on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, or even if you projected it on your smart board and the students are sitting 8 or 10 feet away viewing it. So you can zoom in and see all kinds of amazing detail. Now, I want to give one other digital tip that I have with sharing links out to students for primary sources from the Library of Congress. There's 2 links that you can give students. One of them contains all the bibliographic data. So it's going to have the title and it's going to have the creation date and it's going to have all kinds of additional information. 2 reasons I don't like to share that initially, even with my older students, is because sometimes it gives away too much and I want a little bit of mystery. And the other reason is it can be a little bit muddy and confusing. There can feel like there's a lot there. Yeah. So what I like to do instead is you can always go to a drop down to view a JPEG. And I like to drop down, view the JPEG, and that will bring you to another link, and you share that link with your students. And then if you want to come back after they've explored and analyzed, then you can share the bibliographic data so that they can start to fill in the gaps and confirm some of the things that they've already been believing around their analysis.
Well, and selfishly, and I did go through the books that you had done. Am I correct? Have you done Mary Wears What She Wants by Keith Negley? Because I would like you to do this as your next blog post. It's called Mary Wears.
I don't think I have.
Yeah, Mary Wears What She Wants. My students love it because, and I'll tell you why, it has a black and white picture of, and by the way, it's Negley, Negley, and it is the true story of Mary Edwards Walker, a trailblazing 19th century doctor who was arrested many times for wearing pants. And I read this story to my students, and it is so fantastic because then you show them this black and white photo of this striking woman in a top hat, and she's wearing men's clothing, and she was a Civil War physician. It was an incredible story. And I'm thinking, as the history teacher in me, and my kids are like, all of a sudden they know this is a true story. And that's that is a great storytelling tip, because if you can read a story that is based in historical truth, it happened, all of a sudden the kids listen with different ears. They're like, wait, pause. This really happened to somebody? And you're like, it did. So that's my vote for your next blog post.
Okay, I will take a look at that one. Sometimes too, Amy, I like to start out with the historical photograph because it gives the students exactly what you're saying. It's giving them some context to draw upon. Suddenly the story isn't completely foreign to them. They've had this experience with this photograph, or maybe it's a written document or whatever it is that they can start to connect the story with, which is really powerful.
Well, and I appreciate that, I included a link in the show notes because you did this past spring when we became, and all of us became virtual, you did address these challenges of using these resources in a virtual setting, your picture books and primary sources, teaching and learning from home. So, there is, in some ways, it's easier because you're teaching from home and you can put all of these things on screens. And in other ways, you have to obviously change how you're teaching. I discovered this webpage just quite accidentally, just doing research for this conversation. But I'm so excited that librarians will take an opportunity to look at these education resources from the LOC, because they've done just a fantastic job.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing. Amy, I'm going to have to slip this in real quick.
Please do.
Because I've got one other or a couple. Let me give you two other resources.
That's why we're here.
That if you don't know they're there, you might never stumble across them because they're not embedded in the main search engine of LOC.gov. And one of them, which is one of my favorites, is Chronicling America. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, but this is a digitized newspaper database of over 16 million searchable newspaper pages from the late 1700s, I think, I think now it's up until the 1960s. And it is the richest collection that I've ever seen. And I know so many schools pay for databases like this, but this is out there and it's freely available. But you have to go to chroniclingamerica.loc.gov to be able to search it. And it is an amazing resource. Advertisements, newspaper articles, incredible moments in history captured from perspectives from across the United States, newspapers in different languages from the United States, newspapers that are predominantly African-American newspapers from certain periods of time. And so you get, again, all of these rich perspectives that can be used across so many different learning situations. So that's one resource I want to share that you can only get to from that one spot. And the other one that I want to share out is a whole separate website called the American Archive of Public Broadcasting. And this is a collaboration between the Library of Congress and, WGBH Boston, which is a public station. And what they've done is they've collected about maybe over 6 decades of public radio and public television and digitized large chunks of it and made it available. And these are from public television stations from across the United States. This is a newer resource. It's been around for maybe about less than 5 years. And so it is continually growing. But especially if you're looking for something more recent, and often we run into, at least I do as a librarian, run into hurdles because there's copyright restrictions on things that are from the last over half a century. This particular resource does a really great job with some of their news and investigative journalism that is archived there to be able to grab in and incorporate some of that into your teaching as well. And you get a chance to work with audio. You get a chance to work with video with your students, which is a whole different type of experience. But I also think at times a very engaging type of experience. It's something that in some ways with our kind of YouTube generation that we're used to doing. We're used to watching that video. So we can do that here with that particular resource.
Well, and I do want to thank you because those links are all going to be in the show notes, friends. So, it gives us another reason to go and do a deep dive. And I think that this will, when we're using these sources, I think it's an excellent opportunity to remind our students that we have to give credit where credit's due and to cite where we, this is a good reminder for us as professionals. This is a good reminder for us when these teachable moments, when we're using these resources with our students, to remind them that we need to cite our sources. And just like the librarian who's using it as a teaching resource, or when we introduce these resources to our teachers for them to use as resources. And, this is a great reminder that citing our sources is absolutely key. And the nice thing is that because all of these sources, the Library of Congress and Chronicling America and American Archive, I assume that these have great citation where you can just drop down and do an MLA, or you can do an APA, or, depending on what your school does when it comes to citing our sources, because they know that's why we're using them is to share out with our students. There are days I wish I was still teaching high school social studies. I was a high school social studies teacher before the internet became nearly as accessible as it is. When I taught current events, I got physical copies of the Time magazine to hand out on Tuesdays. I got physical copies of our the Detroit Free Press to hand out to my students, because the internet was not accessible in a way that it is now. So I really think that's fantastic. What advice would you give to school librarians who are using the Library of Congress's digital resources to support not just their own students, but their teachers who are then also going to be using the Library of Congress's digital resources?
I would say two things come to mind. That I think some of the things we've kind of mentioned already, right, with some of the examples, but I think two additional things that come to mind briefly are that as a librarian, I think it's very built into our nature to curate sources for teachers and for students. And we're very good at that. And using the Library of Congress website and these other sites that I've mentioned, you will be able to do that with primary sources. The other thing that I've experienced time and time again is that as librarians, we should not make assumptions that teachers and students know how to use these resources to their most effective nature. So becoming that resource as well in how to interpret the primary source and how to interact with the primary source, and getting ourselves to a place where we feel more comfortable with that, I think is a great thing that we can do as librarians. And it adds a value to what we offer our students and our teachers that I think that's also important. I think we often, at least I do, sit here and sometimes wonder, what am I adding here? Am I being the most valuable, effective librarian as I can? And this is one other layer that you can add, or one other tool that you can add to your tool belt. The second thing I want to mention is that as you're going to do that curation, there is on the LOC.gov page, on many of the pages, it's usually in one of the upper right or left corners, there's often an Ask a Librarian button that shows up. And if you ever get stuck, you've exhausted all of your searching methods that you feel like you know how to do, you can click on that Ask a Librarian button, and it will basically say, what are you looking for? How have you already looked? And let me just put another tip in there. Somewhere in there mention that you are a school librarian or an educator, and it specifically goes to someone on that education team. And so they are very good at then reaching, if they don't know the answer to your question, they're going to reach out to other librarians and historians and archivists within the Library of Congress to figure out if the material you're looking for actually is available on LOC's website. And sometimes they'll even point you in other directions where they'll say, well, we don't have it, but you might look at this institution or that institution.
I love our profession. I really do. Librarians all over the place. This is like a perfect segue. You wrote a book. You wrote a book about using primary resources. I've included a link in the show notes. Could you give us an idea of how your book falls into this conversation?
So this book that I was tasked with writing is focused in on using primary sources with elementary students. And it even more heavily focuses in on that area that I've emphasized today, which is actually going beyond finding the sources, but really trying to answer the question of what are the many ways that you can use these sources? What are the many ways that students can interact with these sources to have really engaging and effective learning? So we go over multiple strategies. We break it down with examples. I talk about using the different strategies and primary sources in different subject areas. So getting sometimes outside of that history bubble. Obviously, we've talked about some literature, doing it in language arts, but also what could it look like in science or in math? What role might primary sources play in those different subjects as well? And the goal was really to capture where I was at that time with my thinking around primary sources. And of course, it continues to evolve as we all do as educators, but I really feel proud of what it does as far as being hopefully a really great resource for librarians or for teachers. And I'll tell you this too, this goes all the way down to talking about using primary sources with our kindergarten students, our younger students who might be pre-readers and emerging readers. But I also intentionally wrote it just as kind of a side note. It doesn't show up anywhere on the cover, but my intention was also to write it in a way that you could take out about 10 pages of the book and it would work really well for a middle school teacher as well. And I've heard from high school librarians who said that they've used elements of it also. So not to try to, too broadly say what it can do, but the intention was really to talk about elementary and middle school librarians, even though it's titled Elementary Educator's Guide to Primary Sources. It has a little bit of a broader scope.
Well, and I really do. I think anytime a librarian puts something together for educators, again, we're coming at this from a different perspective than if it was written by a strictly classroom educator speaking to educators. I want to just ask, it sounds like you are entering the field of podcasting very soon. And I welcome. It's a lot of fun. Please tell us about your dipping the toe into the field of podcasting.
So I've been listening to lots of podcasts, and I had someone ask the question actually several years ago, could you do a podcast about primary sources? And at the time, I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. I kept thinking of the visuals that were involved and how challenging that might be. And there's actually a wonderful podcast that started to come out from the National Portrait Gallery. And of course, portraits, you're thinking of all those visuals. And it really just kind of clicked with me. Okay, this could definitely be applicable to how we address primary sources. So it's going to be called the Primary Source Podcast. The first episode is going to go up right around late August of 2020 or maybe early September. And what it is going to hope to do is really explore what we've been talking about for our time here today, which is how primary sources can be effectively used in education. And we're going to do everything from, sometimes I'll be going solo on occasion, and sometimes I'll be bringing in some friends that I have that are from these institutions that I talked about, hopefully get someone in from the Library of Congress, the National Portrait Gallery, the American Archive of Public Broadcasting, some of these institutions, talking to local institutions and bringing in some archivists and historians from those folks, and then bringing in librarians and educators that are using primary sources and talking through what they're doing. So everything from where do you find it to how do you use it to what are some of my resources out there where I can grow my PLN. We're going to try to cover it all within the realm of primary sources through this podcast format, and I'm really looking forward to it. Amy, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Do you have one great tip for me as I'm getting ready to start? I'm going to ask the question now. You've got to ask me lots of questions. I'm going to ask a question.
All right. Okay. So, pro tip for somebody who's been doing this for a while now, I will tell you that I think the important thing is to expect a certain amount of organic process to take place when your podcast gets off the ground. I think you can plan what kinds of episodes you envision for season 1, for season 2. But to be fair, that when you have a podcast which works with an audience to give some direction to where your next episodes are going to be, I don't think anybody would be surprised if I confess here that I have no idea what episodes will be broadcast in September or in October or in November. And I don't find that daunting. I find that thrilling. I find that exciting because my podcasts largely come from the conversations I have with my guests. They spiral into another episode, or one thing leads to another. And I think that a podcast that grows with its audience is one that will find its own energy, if I can say that. You will find yourself propelled by ideas that your listeners give you, as much as the ones you stumble across just sort of in your day-to-day. So I think that embracing how your podcast grows, thanks to the feedback you get from your listeners, is probably what is my advice to you.
I love that advice. And you know what? I was connecting with it as you were saying it, because last night I was virtually talking to 2 librarian friends, and I kind of spilled the beans on this podcast coming out. We were just kind of talking about what we've been doing over the summer. And by the end of our conversation, I had them as 2 guests that were going to be coming on. So I completely hear what you say. And I love that idea that, to kind of let it grow in the direction that it wants to grow.
Yes, which is an excellent opportunity for me to share with listeners good news. This is not the last we've heard from Tom. Tom is actually going to revisit the podcast because Tom actually was on the Caldecott committee and has generously agreed to come back to the podcast and share with us, as Casey Boyd talked to us about her Newberry experience. Tom is going to come back and talk to us about his Caldecott experience. So Tom, I know this is not goodbye, and I am so excited that we are going to get to talk again very soon.
I love talking picture books, so I will love to talk about this Caldecott experience with you. I'm really looking forward to it.
Would you let us know where we can find you on social media? Because adding you to our PLN is key.
I primarily am on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @CaptainLibrary. That's the name of my school, so I'm not trying to be pompous or anything. And I'm also on Instagram under the same handle, but I'm a bit more of a lurker at this point, right there. And if you happen to find me on Facebook, you'll probably find me more in like the Future Ready Librarians group or some of the many librarians groups that are on there on Facebook.
Fantastic. Friends, again, we're going to catch up with Tom in a few weeks' time, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Again, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
So grateful that Tom was able to share both his time and his expertise with us today. Friends, you will definitely want to be checking out the links and the resources in today's show notes. I expect some of you might even want to arrange for a time with your administration to share what you've learned today with some of your teaching staff, and possibly add some of these links to your library resource page. If you found today's episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. The topic of our next episode will be virtual book clubs and my interview with Kitty Feldy. I hope you will tune in.